Wait for the final few to join. A very good evening, everyone. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Alex LeVay. I'm one of the core team here at Conservative Voice. Thrilled to welcome you to our latest in the hot seat session. Before I hand over to Don Porter to introduce our speaker,
I am, but I can't get in here.
I'd just like to go through a few housekeeping points.
Russia has accused the West of
The first
pushing
of which
towards storming major
if you could
cities.
please put yourselves on mute.
Between the two sides, with Ukrainian negotiators saying Moscow is adopting a more
there's quite a bit of background noise, so if you could please put yourself on mute, that would be appreciated. And to keep yourselves on mute throughout the session. Thank you to all of my props who just gave a fantastic demo of why
I can't get any. I
we
can't hear anyone.
So
Anne-Marie, I can hear you.
Anyone? I can't hear him.
there we are. So in a second I'll hand over to Don, and our speaker will speak for a few minutes. Then we'll move on to a Q&A. If you could let me know whether you'd like to ask a question by writing to me directly using the chat function at the bottom of the screen, I'll be grateful. And if you could also let me know the sort of question you'd like to ask, so I'll be able to more effectively group those together, that would be great. Please do keep your questions as concise as possible so we can get through as many as possible. But without further ado, Don, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, and good evening, everyone. Just to let you know that in conversation with Tom a few minutes ago, there is a vote in about 16 minutes, or it was then 16 minutes. Tom has very kindly agreed to go and vote and then come back to us to continue the session. So we'll keep each other entertained for the few minutes that he's voting. But a little bit of background. First of all, for the regular followers, this is the 34th hot seat, and it's the highest response we have had in the 2 years we've been doing virtual, with about 200 people registered this evening, and a particular welcome to our friends who are on the line from overseas. Very briefly, Tom, the Member of Parliament for Tunbridge and Malling since 2015, a journalist and PR consultant in the Middle East prior to that, and an officer in the British Army Reserve serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. Reading theology at Bristol University and a master's in Islamic studies in Gonville and Keys. In my view, Tom is one of the high flyers of the 2015 intake, a forward-thinking politician. His 2018 keynote speech on community conservatism, encouraging businesses to better serve the communities in which they operate. The youngest ever person to chair the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I think those of you who saw it and heard it, one of the best speeches I've heard for a very long time in the House was his contribution to the debate on the fall of Kabul, where he said, this doesn't need to be defeat, but right now it damn well feels like it. Ladies and gentlemen, I've spoken with some of his colleagues in the last couple of weeks. The message is consistent, a very highly rated colleague and extremely well liked. Tom, I'm delighted to see you, and over to you.
Well, Don, look, thank you very much indeed for hosting me. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Of all the fantastic people I can see here, there's one I must particularly acknowledge. Dennis, you are my chairman. I hope you don't deselect me for anything I'm going to say this evening. It's very nice to see you. I know who I work for. Look, it's a huge pleasure to be with you this evening, because this is a gathering of friends and an opportunity to talk about a few of the issues that I think fundamentally matter to all of us. This is, of course, a challenge not just that we have as Conservatives, but as Brits. But I think the Conservative approach that we traditionally take is the answer, and it's worth remembering why. Because today we are looking at a world that is under threat, a world that we've built up over 70, 80 years, a world of interrelated agreements and relationships, excuse me, a world that has effectively been the kind of world that we would all recognize for much the last 60, 70 years, which is a sort of what we loosely call the sort of liberal order, the democratic world, the West, if you like, although the West isn't quite right, because of course it includes Japan and South Korea. But there's a whole series of sort of intertwined relationships that have come to build up the world that we recognize around us. And for the first time, excuse me, I do apologize. For the first time in generations, by which I mean 2 or 3, it is really and fundamentally under threat. And it's under threat because of the actions of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. And what he's doing, as we know, is he's not just challenging Ukraine, he's challenging the democracies of Eastern Europe, he's challenging the peaceful order that we have built up, and he's challenging NATO and our different alliances. And his arguments are that such peace and prosperity, such democracy, such cooperation threatens him. Now, on one level, he's completely wrong. He's completely wrong because it doesn't threaten him. There's no intention at all of crossing his border or putting any troops in Russia. But he's completely right in the sense that the example of success elsewhere causes resentments at home.
Yeah, sorry.
And so he's, hello, it was good to have agreement so early on. It certainly does threaten him in the sense that the example that he fears is a democratic Ukraine. Now, he summarizes it by saying he objects to NATO, but what he actually objects to is is Ukraine's success in the sense of order. And it's worth remembering that, sadly, this is not the first time we've faced such threats. And the answers today are the same as the answers were, not identical, but come from a similar route. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. Come from the same route as the answers of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, which is that the answers are fundamentally conservative. Now, I happen to be very much of a Reaganite in the sense of foreign policy. I think his approach was extremely powerful, and I think he and Margaret Thatcher made an extraordinary team at a time when Britain and the world needed conservative policies to face down totalitarianism. And we need to remember that although much of their policy solution has been seen as foreign, by which I mean defense and intelligence, a lot of their answers were actually domestic. You know, what Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan actually did was they reformed their countries at home to make sure that we were structured to respond abroad. And a lot of that reform came as our economies were frankly basket cases. I mean, we remember it of our own, but we forget it of the United States. But large amounts of inflation was a huge problem for many Western countries. Can you feel an echo? Rising energy prices was a huge problem for many countries in the early 1970s. Again, you may see an echo. Now, I'm certainly not saying that everything that we're watching today is a direct copy of the 1970s. Of course, that's not true. But there are many overlaps that we need to consider. And I think that the real challenge for us all now is to look at the world as we see it, to recognize that the world as we wished it to have been is eroding, is being undermined, but that many of the conservative answers that we see or we know are necessary today are indeed the ones that we can build on from the past. Now, I would urge us to think quite clearly immediately about a few immediate responses. The first is defense spending. Look, I'm really sorry because I wish we could spend the money on other things in many ways. I mean, I would rather, for very obvious reasons, spend the money on fixing our NHS or repairing our roads. But if we can't defend ourselves, then frankly, it doesn't really matter what we spend on anything else. We'll be directly threatened. So I'm afraid we do need to spend more on defense, and we need to do it now. The second thing we need to really look at is our alliances. Now, we have spent an awful lot of time looking at the way in which we work with our partners in Europe and our partners around the world. And, you know, nobody, quite rightly, wants to go back through the last 5 years, and any suggestion that we should is frankly bonkers. What we need to do is to look at our European partners as they are today and our NATO alliance as it is today, and work out ways in which we can all work together. Now, this last series of actions by President Putin has in some ways actually helped us. May not be quite so obvious, but it's helped us in the sense that for the first time in 20, 30 years, many countries that have traditionally seen life through a Brussels lens are remembering that the nation state matters. And I think that's a very useful lesson for all of us, particularly a very useful lesson for the UK, because we are a natural part of building up that partnership of nations that doesn't necessarily, and from our perspective, shouldn't always go through Brussels. So I hope that we're onto a different stage of the European conversation, which is one that we can build from rather than one that we can dwell in. Now, there are many other areas I'm sure that you will want me to touch on, and I'd be very happy to. But the last bit I'm going to talk about before I come to questions, so that was just a warm up, basically, for your questions to be ready. The last thing I want to touch on is when we talk about some of the answers to the 1970s challenges and 1980s challenge of facing totalitarianism, one of the key elements that we needed to get right before we could win those struggles was to get our domestic issues sorted. And that's really where I'd like to talk very briefly about growth, because there are various ways of running an economy, as we all know. And one of them is to treat it like a household budget. And though Margaret Thatcher always spoke about it as though it was a household budget, she always knew it wasn't. Part of her genius was that she managed to make it understandable as though it was a household, but always had the economic background to know that actually a government is not a house, because you have the ability, as you know, to go multi-generational in ways that... Oh, sorry, Mr. Hughes. What I think we need to be thinking about now then is how do we talk about what inflation is going to have, or what impact inflation is going to have on our lives, what impact we need to be thinking about taxation, and where we need to be thinking about our own responsibilities. And I think here is where we need to look at going for growth rather than simply going for a balanced economy. Because although we do need to get back to a conservative, an honest conservative budget, what we need to get first is we need to get the growth that allows that to happen. And I think that's where we need to be looking in our economic policy today. Now, I'm going to stop there because I'm going to have to run in. I can see the minister's on his feet in about 4 minutes. So I reckon I can get one question in and then run, then come back.
Thank you very much. Just as a prelude to the questions, please keep them as short as you possibly can. And also, if you could state your name and also where you're from, either in the country or the world, that'd be very helpful, please. So our first question, Vivian Branson, please. If you could take yourself off mute and put your video on as well. Thank you.
Hello, Vivian.
I think Vivian might be having trouble. If Armarine, in that case, Armarine, could we come to you, please?
Yes, hi, thank you. So my question is, I'm sorry, I'm on a mobile. So great to see the joint sanctions. I don't know whether you can see me. My question is, having Russia out of SWIFT, will this not provide an opportunity for China's CIPs, which is the cross-border interbank payment system, to launch China's digital currency in alliance with Russia? Will it not jeopardize the Western financial credit markets' influence and strengthen China's hold on yet another element of the market?
So I haven't been saved by the bell. I've got 2 minutes before I need to run. The question of CIPs is a relevant one, but the connection is not directly into their crypto. So their electronic payments is not the same as their crypto payments. And there are real problems for them on crypto payments, the same as everybody else, which is the crypto payments are actually public in many ways, much more public than normal bank transfers. And they may be less controllable, but they're certainly more public. And on your point about interbank payments, Marine, you're absolutely right. And by the way, it's nice to see you again. You're absolutely right that it does push Russia in that direction. But China's payment system has long been pushed by Beijing with not huge amounts of success. I don't think that Russia's payment system is going to make a tremendous difference, but you're right, it does make some.
Thank you.
Tom, do you have time for one more, or do you need to run?
I think I'd better run and then I'll vote and I'll come back. I will be back, excuse me.
Just an idea of one thing to fill the time, and forgive me because we've not had this situation before, but we'll try our best. Quite a few questions have come in just around how much money we should be spending on defence each year, the percentage of GDP. So I thought if you could use the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, maybe to raise a hand, and then we'll just see how much people think we should be spending on defence. So I'm going to start low and work my way up. Please leave your hand up for every percentage point. So should we be spending at least 2% of our GDP on defence? If you could raise your hand if you agree with that statement, please. Give a few minutes. Good. I think broad consensus for 2%. So you're definitely on the right call, which is good. 3%. So should we be spending at least 3% of our GDP on defence? Not much change there. 4%. Okay, slightly fewer. 5%. 6%. 7%. 8%. I'm going to jump to 10 just to see who can choose only 10%.
Oui, je vais être prête. Il est parti voter. Il est...
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. So I think that the most common sort of response was 4%, but a great range between 2 and 4%. And just one more question, and then I'll perhaps hand over to Don. So if you had a choice between either scrapping the NI rise that's due to come in or redirecting the NI rise towards defence, what would you pick? So if you prefer to scrap the NI rise, please keep your hand down. If you'd prefer to keep the NI rise but redirect that extra money towards defence, could you raise your hand? Thank you very much. We can definitely put those sort of points to Tom when he comes back, but Don, perhaps I can hand over to you.
Yeah, many thanks, Alex, and for the opportunity really to tell people and remind others that incredibly this is the 10th anniversary of Conservative Voice starting. We had a great launch. Our guest speakers at the time were David Davis, Fox, Steve Barclay, Priti Patel, many of them at the time not probably thinking they were going to end up in the positions they are currently in. But one thing that we'd like to hear from you, and either send an email or send a message or however you wish, but how would you like to have a special event to celebrate our 10 years? Where would you like it to be now that things are easier? And importantly, who are the speakers you'd like at that? I see it, and I know Alex and Brian agree with me, to be not just speech, but also a social. And so if you could let us have your thoughts at some stage of where you would like it to be, what you would like it to be, and also in terms of future speakers. We have done extremely well through personal contacts, friends, and the quality of speakers we've had. But if you could let us know who in the next hot seat you would like to see there, that'd be very helpful to us. And if you are going to the spring conference this weekend in Blackpool, I will be there. I know Brian Hamill and I know a few others here on the screen will be there. Then let's get together either on the Friday or the Saturday morning in between speeches. But that would be a good opportunity for you to let us know about future speakers, either from the cabinet or indeed from the back benches. You'll have noticed in recent times we've tended to go for people who, in our opinion, are heading towards a future cabinet. And I think, judging on the feedback we've had, that has been very popular. We've had some very good sessions. And tonight, the first thing that Tom said when we always have 2 minutes briefing before these sessions go live, first of all, to make sure that we do have a speaker. And secondly, just to brief in the way the session is going to be run by Alex. So the first thing Tom said was, Donna, huge apologies that I've just got to go and vote in then 16 minutes. And he said, but most definitely, I do want to come back. I told him that this was the largest audience we've had so far since we went virtual 2 years ago. And we have a very large number of people who tuned in this evening from our friends Conservatives Abroad. And that was a very effective link up we did with Heather Harper's team. And I'm sure you can understand that one of the side effects of COVID is that ministers have not really been traveling overseas, except as briefly as possible to do the business and get out. So there has been no opportunity for people to actually have a social event. And I've been to some of them overseas. They're extremely well organized by the strong team in Conservatives Abroad. So they haven't had the visitors. So when we had the link up, that was much appreciated by our friends around the globe. And I think on one occasion, which I think is quite remarkable, we had people on the west coast of the States and in Asia on the line in the same evening, which shows a huge amount of commitment and enthusiasm. So just a little bit of background to where we're going this year, what is happening, and the importance of maintaining this link with Conservatives Abroad. In the interim, Tom will be in the lobbies queuing or going through. Is there anybody like to ask the three of us, Brian, Alex, and myself, a question? Please indicate, and Alex will bring you in.
Yes, Susan on the left there, your hand up.
Yes. Considering that the what is going on in Ukraine is unachievable for the Ukrainians, would it not be wise for them to opt for examples set by Ireland, Austria, Sweden, Finland, the Vatican City, and Switzerland by not joining NATO?
Well, it is a serious consideration. I wouldn't say that I am equipped to give a substantial answer to your question, but except I think that is the type of question that should be put to Tom when he returns. And by the way, those, just to say to people who tonight, because we've got so many on the line, there still may not be time to take all your questions. If you were to email those in, we will send them to Tom and make sure that there is an answer to your question. So I know that Alex will do his usual superb orchestration of the questions. And he will invariably, I think, I'm sure tonight, say there's quite a number of people who have not had the opportunity to put a question. But Seaton, I'm very grateful for you putting that. I would not wish to step on the toes of our distinguished speaker this evening. And I think I would allow him to answer either live tonight or post the event.
Thank you.
And anybody, a question that, let's say, is in the remit of the organisers and founders of Conservative Voice. Any particular, back to the topics I raised just a few minutes ago, anything that you really would like to see us doing in the future?
Hello.
Hi, Tom.
I'm back.
Tom,
My apologies.
tried to keep the wheel going. It is, I think, still spinning, and everybody's still with us. So welcome back. Over to you.
So I apologize. So questions were coming in. I apologize for having run out. Far away.
What time are you closed, Tom? Are you okay till 7 o'clock?
Absolutely. Yes, I hope so. I mean, I shouldn't be voting again, but you never know.
Good.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let's kick back off then with Alex Pouffet, please, to ask a question.
Good evening, Tom. I'm zooming from your neighbouring constituency of Tunbridge Wells. Is there anything more we can do to thwart Putin's grossly narcissistic invasion of Ukraine? Thank you.
Well, the first thing we've got to do is more of the same, I'm afraid, which is more weapons, more different forms of weaponry, and also the sanctions. I've been, I mean, as many of you will know, the Foreign Affairs Committee, which I'm lucky enough to chair, has been pushing for different forms of sanctions, or rather recognizing the threat that corrupt money faces in our system since 2018, when we published our Moscow's Gold Report, and we've been pushing very hard on different areas. So I'm glad that the government is now doing that. I think that what Ben Wallace has been doing is extremely good, and I think he's been front and center. What I'd actually like to see us do is to use the Foreign Office better to build up the network of alliances and partnerships that will encircle and defend our interests. Because what we're looking at, if you like, is a building that we have relied on for a long time that is beginning to crumble, and we can surround it by scaffolding and prop it up for a bit, but we can only prop it up for a bit if we don't start rebuilding the inside and the foundations. And I think that's where we need to be putting the Foreign Office, not just into the scaffolding, but actually into the core of the building and helping to reinforce it. And when you look at organizations like, the United Nations or NATO, I mean, great, but you may not like the EU. I tell you, you have a good look inside NATO and you'll find something you really don't like. It's really badly corrupt. It's got huge numbers of internal issues, and it's a very, very difficult international organization. You look at the WTO, it's largely dysfunctional. The UN is largely dysfunctional. There's an awful lot of work to be done on rebuilding quite a lot of these international organizations. And I think that's where we need to be putting a huge amount of effort now to make sure that they don't collapse again.
Thank you. Lewis Fielder, please.
Hi, Lewis.
Good evening, Tom. It's very positive to hear in the past 24 hours that the Ukrainian government are now seemingly in constructive talks with the Russian government, who seem to be willing to now discuss a negotiated peace and a ceasefire. But given that the Ukrainians are quite rightly not going to settle for anything less than full withdrawal from Ukrainian territory, including those previously illegally annexed areas in the Donbass and Crimea, and given that Putin is unlikely to walk away voluntarily empty-handed and needs to save face, do you think there's any likely diplomatic way out of this, or are the terrible consequences of ongoing military conflicts the only option?
Well, I hope very much there are diplomatic ways out of this, but I'm afraid you're right in that, the Russians wouldn't be coming to the table unless their defeat looked pretty inevitable to them. Now, I don't know the internal circumstances of the Russian military. I know that some of our colleagues do, but I don't. And but I can tell you from the outside, as a former army officer, it doesn't look good. If you effectively can't reach beyond 145 kilometers from your railhead, that tells me that you can't operate logistics supplies beyond the reach of a single day's fuel run, which is not very impressive. So it suggests to me that the Russians actually have many, many very severe problems militarily. And I think that there are, there's a lot of people who are writing much more intelligently about it than I am. So I hope that that means that the conversation with Zelensky and the Ukrainians is getting somewhere. I don't see how Zelensky agrees to anything other than full territorial integrity. After all, sovereignty is something we had a vote on only a few years ago. We take it seriously. Why shouldn't they? I'm sure they do. In fact, I know they do, and we all know they do, because we can see the extraordinary courage of the Ukrainian, not just armed forces, but an entire nation that has responded to this aggression in a particularly unified way, and a leader who's demonstrated that ability to bring people together with integrity and courage that is, frankly, inspirational wherever you are in the world. So I think that that's where we are. I mean, if the Russians can come to a conversation where, they can withdraw and claim victory, fine. I mean, they're already lying to their own people as much as they can. If they continue lying to them, that's their own business. But I don't see how Zelensky can concede anything much, to be honest.
Tom, if I could just group a few questions together. While you were away, we did a bit of a poll on what we think should be spent on defence as a percentage of GDP. The most common percentage was 4%, with some colleagues believing we should spend in excess of 10%. Just to group a few points together, what's your view? How much should we be spending on defence?
So I'm not, this is a slightly odd one. I'm not really a believer in percentage targets. I'm a believer in you buy what you need and you send me the bill for what I need, rather than here's a target. I think there's various things that we need to look at, right? So the first is we've got 6 Type 45s, 5 of them are tied up alongside. Why? Because they haven't got enough capability to get them out and about, because their servicing is delayed. We've got 2 aircraft carriers, but we've got the aircraft for a third of one. We don't have the submarines yet to protect a fleet underway. Those are just naval capabilities. You look at the army, it's now at the smallest size it's been since 1800. If we could, best effort, I suspect we could put 15, 20,000 men in the field. The Russians have just put 190. There's a whole series of sort of comparators which tell me that, now I happen to think that 20,000 British soldiers would, in fact, I think there's even more now, 20,000 British soldiers would easily outmatch 190,000 Russians, but that's not the only equation that matters. As Stalin put it, quantity has a quality all of its own. So I do think we need to look at these things. Now, all of these things come with a price tag, right? And we know it. And this is where we need to look at how we pay that price tag, because it's not just about defense on its own. It's about where defense sits in a wider panoply. Now, defense also, by the way, is quite a good way of kickstarting some industries. The Germans use it, after all, to subsidize their auto industry, and training up young people in new, in ways that sort of encourage personal discipline and leadership and other such good things I think it's a good thing for people. Now, I'm not a believer in national service, but I do think encouraging people to do their bit and to get the skills from it is certainly a good thing to do. So I don't think we should look at defense as though it was, that's just for tanks and that's it. I mean, some of it's, if you like, some of it's part of the education spend, some of it's part of the aid spend, some of it's part of the diplomacy spend, some of it's, you can look at it in different ways. And I think as conservatives, I think the key to look at it is not just as a sort of a 4% on this, 5% on that, 10% on that, is to look at it as a wider whole of government, whole of community, whole of nation approach. And I think that's exactly what we should be doing.
Thank you. Steve Smith, your question next, please.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm a councillor down in Bristol, in your old stamping ground, I believe.
It is, yeah. You're winning now, though. When I was there, nobody was winning. And
we're getting there. We're doing all right. There's been some worrying stories out just in the last few hours about China potentially starting to support Putin in Ukraine. Do you give that much credence? And if it happens, does that start taking us into some sort of a bigger proxy war? Thank you.
I mean, I give it some credence. I wouldn't. I mean, I'm certain that China wants Russia to win. Having launched this assault, I'm sure that they want Russian victory. But I also think they're slightly cautious about how much they want to intervene. And so I suspect that most of the support will come through the ways in which we've seen it already, which is buying Russian energy and making sure their banks have access to some, as Amarine put it, to some international payment system. I mean, I wouldn't overstate that either, because China's system doesn't reach as far as the SWIFT system for rather obvious reasons. So I think there is some element there. But I think, I think China's looking at this in two ways. One, they're looking at the comparison between Ukraine and Taiwan, and thinking that, if you can't even cross the border with 190,000 troops to a very flat piece of land, how much harder is it to go 100 miles by sea onto a mountainous island? And they're also looking at the Western response, or the democratic response, and seeing this extraordinary unity all the way from Japan to the United States, and seeing that this is not quite what they expected. So I think China's thinking about this is evolving. And I think what's interesting about their position, I mean, nobody expected them to vote against Russia in the UN, but it is interesting they abstained, and they didn't support Russia. I wouldn't overstate it. I mean, that's basically a holding reply, if you like. And I think I think that Beijing is watching this with great interest and trying to work out what to do next.
Florence, forgive me in advance for probably mispronouncing your name, but Martin Bubitz, if you could correct me and also say where you're from, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's Marcin, but of course it's more common just to use Martin, because it's just the same name. So good evening, everyone. Good evening, Tom. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to you today. So I'm joining you today from Lublin, Poland. It's one of the biggest and the nearest cities to Ukraine. We are very few steps before the migration crisis upcoming in our city, in our country. My question to you is, do you have any recommendations on how can we handle this migration crisis? And is there a space for British-Polish cooperation in this particular area? In Poland, we do feel your support. We really appreciate this. We really hold on British-Polish alliance that we find very important.
I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you there. I think we've got your question just to fit as many as we can. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Marcin, I think there's two elements in that. One, yes, there is more that we can do. Of course there is. And I think, first of all, a huge tribute has to go out to the Polish people for the extraordinary generosity they've demonstrated to what is now 2.5 million Ukrainians who've crossed the border. I mean, it's frankly, the act of generosity is fabulous. I was speaking to the Polish foreign minister this morning. Sorry, days seem to go quickly these days. And he was pointing out with great pride and quite correctly that there are no refugee camps in Poland. Now that's a phenomenal achievement, because it means that the Polish people are welcoming those who need it into their homes, into hostels and hotels and places where they can be accommodated into a society rather than separated from it. And I have to say that's an extraordinary achievement by the Polish people. We should first of all be grateful for that. Secondly, we should also welcome the fact that we have an easier route to support in that way, in the sense that we can support the Polish government directly, and the Polish government can manage it perfectly effectively on their own. Now, we also, by the way, I think need to help the World Food Programme and others who are helping inside Ukraine, because I think we need to recognize there's 40 million people in Ukraine, of whom about 5 have crossed the border. So, we still need to support a lot of people inside Ukraine as well. And that doesn't mean, there's not a competition, as it were, but it's just we need to recognize that. But I think that there's further we can go. And this is one of the reasons that I think that this is an interesting time for many of us, because the changing way in which European countries are working together is beginning to become clearer. I mean, the reality is what we're seeing at the moment is the reassertion of the nation state. Now, I know many of us have been believers in a rather more fundamental sense than some of our European partners in the nation state for a long time. But what Poland is demonstrating, Hungary and Slovakia and Romania, is that ease with which nation states can deal with each other don't have to be always, moderated through a central grouping. And I think that's an interesting change for all of us. Now, I think that's an opportunity for all of us, and we need to handle it gently and sensitively, because certainly Poland and Hungary, they're not about to leave the European Union. They have no intention of leaving the European Union, but this is a way in which we can work together in a different way and leave them to decide how they wish to conduct their trade relationship, but we can conduct many other relationships in different ways.
Thank you. Just in the interest of time, I think we'll take 2 questions at a time from here on in. And if you could please keep them as short as possible, just so we can fit as many of them as possible, that would be much appreciated. So if we could take Simon, your question first, please. I don't have your last name, but Simon first, and then straight over to Charles James, please, for a second question.
Hi, Simon Glass. I'm the Conservatives Abroad rep for Australia, but actually in New Jersey, America today. Bemoaning Biden's dreadful leadership on crime, economy and foreign policy. Should we put troops on the ground in Ukraine? We've been invited to do so. We weren't invited to do so in parts of the Middle East. Should we put troops on the ground in Taiwan now, so we precursor any potential repeat of Ukraine?
Thanks, Simon. And Charles, your question, please.
Yes, so I think Tom touched on this briefly beforehand, but obviously the precedent has been set with Russia invading Ukraine in terms of sanctions against the country and its oligarchs and its businesses. So I'm asking Tom the question, is this now going to be a normal thing if a foreign power invades another sovereign state? Will sanctions be automatically placed on that invading state?
Okay. So on the question on troops in Ukraine, I'm not in favor of troops in Ukraine for the very simple reason that one of the strongest defenses of Ukraine at the moment is that it's not a whole of nation response from Russia. What you're seeing at the moment is the Russian military and Putin's cabal around him conducting a war, and most of the Russian people basically wishing it weren't happening, and some extraordinarily courageous people actually protesting against it. I think if we were to put NATO troops into Ukraine, that would change that into a NATO versus Russia competition. You'd see a united Russia. And I think that would ironically weaken, not strengthen Ukraine and make it harder for them to come out of it. Your question on Taiwan is interesting. There are some American troops in Taiwan, and I'm not going to enormously disagree with your analysis of US leadership. No, I won't labor the point. There are some US troops in Taiwan, and they're helping to train up the Taiwanese Marines and Air Force and so on. Is there more that we could do? Yes. Given our own, sadly, rather too reduced military numbers, there's not an awful lot that the UK can do, but I would encourage the US to do it. And certainly if symbolically we can help, fine. But I think we need to really focus on building up our own defense of the eastern border of NATO, which, let's not forget, is actually our eastern border. I mean, the great success of our forefathers in that period of 1940s, in those early 1940s, 1950s, is what they did is they pushed our border away from Dover, to, well, it wasn't quite that far. It was about 1,500 miles to the east when they first did it. And it's now about 3,000 miles to the east and about 2,000 miles south. And that's a phenomenal success because it's given us something that a small island like ours can't always achieve, which is strategic depth. I mean, normally you have to be, United States or Canada to get this kind of strategic depth. Well, we've got it through NATO. So, we need to celebrate that and make sure we defend it. Now, the point Charles made about sanctions, I think it is going to be one of those normal things. And one of the challenges that we've got with sanctions is to make sure that we use them appropriately. They're not a knee-jerk response to a sort of a political answer. They've got to be legal, because what we can't do is undermine our reputation for being fair players or interesting, or an open market by simply using sanctions as a sort of knee-jerk political tool. They're not. They can be a response to a particular threat, but they have to be a response to a particular threat or to criminality, of course. Unexplained wealth orders are actually just a response to criminality. They can't be just some sort of political revenge taking. That I'm afraid is not the way to use them.
Thank you. For our next two, could we have Trevor Hewson, please, first, and then followed directly by Adrian, second, please. But Trevor, to you first.
Hi. Do you think, knowing how Putin has acted so far in invading Ukraine, that it's inevitable that NATO will actually have to get involved?
Thank you. Adrian, over to you.
Good evening, Tom. I was wondering, given the billions that Putin's earning with the oil exports and oil and gas exports, whether more could be done to persuade, especially Europe, to stop importing the oil and gas, which is effectively funding all the bombs and missiles and tanks at the moment. Thank you.
Right. Let me hit them both. Look, NATO is involved in the sense that NATO is supplying, or rather NATO member states are supplying huge amounts of weapons and ammunition into Ukraine. I mean, even non-NATO countries like Sweden are supplying guns and ammo. So, I mean, you know, there's an awful lot going in. And NATO is also involved because the NATO guarantee is what makes sure that, well, I hope, what makes sure that Putin realizes that he can't try this in Latvia or Lithuania. So NATO in that sense is already involved because the commitment, the defense commitment under Article 5 is hugely important. I don't think it is inevitable that we get involved directly in Ukraine, though. I mean, I think that we should conduct our policies in such a way that defends our interests, but doesn't draw us in. That's difficult. I admit that's difficult, but I think there are various. I think that making sure that the Ukrainians are properly supplied with weapons and that we support those civil areas, civil defense, and so on, are absolutely fundamental to making sure that we achieve our aims without drawing ourselves in. And Adrian, your question on oil and gas is entirely fair. The problem that the Germans in particular, but others have as well, is they don't have much of a choice. And if the Germans were to ban Russian gas imports today, quite literally thousands of Germans would die of cold. There really just isn't a choice. And that's a very difficult decision for Germany. I see that, which is why what we need to be doing, and what Germany needs to be doing as well, is getting away from its rather bizarre idea that on nuclear power and reversing some of its somewhat idealistic ideas of energy transformation, and get back to supporting its own energy production from sources that it can actually control. Now, I think there's an awful lot to do there. But the next thing we need to do is to make sure that European countries, our own included, by the way, is not so totally reliant on sources of energy that are outside our control. And before you think that's just oil and gas, don't forget 80% of the world's batteries are made in China. So there are some other elements there as well.
Thank you.
For our next two, could we have Tamara, please, followed by Colin? And if you could say where you are as well, that'd be very helpful, and as short as possible for the questions, then we might be able to fit one more round in. Thank you.
Hello there, this is Tamara, known as Tammy from the Telford Association. Hello, Tom.
Hi, Tamara, how are you?
Yeah, does the Ukraine-Russian issue detract from the Prime Minister's recent misdemeanours? And what do you think should and will happen next?
And Colin, your question, please.
Yes, Colin Blackwell, Vice Chairman of Conservatives Abroad. So firstly, I just want to thank you for everything that you do for Conservatives Abroad over the years, including, of course, as President of our group in Paris. Today, we've got people on this call out in the east as far as New Zealand, and out to the west as far as California and British Columbia. So most of the globe covered. I just wanted to follow on from your questioning of the Foreign Secretary at your committee last week, in which you suggested that perhaps the ICC may not be statutorily correctly formed in order to be able to pursue war crimes cases in Ukraine, and that a alternative.
That's not what I said.
Might be required. Well, we'd like to hear your views, because obviously Don Raab is in The Hague today. Thanks.
So let me, I'll come to you in a second, Tammy. Let me start off with this. Let me start off with the second one. I was quite careful to what I said to the Foreign Secretary, because the ICC is correctly formed to pursue war crimes cases. What it's not, and specifically not created to do, and in fact the treaty is very clear on what it is and what it can and what it can't do, is it is formed to look into war crimes, but it's not formed to look into crimes of aggression. So when the Nuremberg trials were launched in 46 and the Tokyo trials in 46, 47, one of the charges brought against the belligerents then was against the Nazi regime and against the Japanese regime was that of the crime of aggression. Now, that was never brought into the ICC, and it was deliberately not brought into the ICC because the ICC was evolved out of the concept of the civil wars of the 1980s and 90s. It didn't evolve out of state-on-state violence. And so the question I was asking the Foreign Secretary was, should we look again at the state-on-state violence element of this? And should we talk about, therefore, the crime of aggression? Now, interestingly, the crime of aggression is brought into Russian criminal law. And it was because, of course, the Nuremberg laws were then brought into all of our domestic laws in various different ways. We didn't introduce the crime of aggression into ours, but the Russians did, surprisingly, perhaps. And so Russian Criminal Code 353 includes the crime of aggression. So Putin could get 15 to 20 years under Russia's own criminal code. I mean, yeah, chance would be a fine thing, don't get me wrong. I'm not expecting a trial anytime soon. But, you know, under Russia's own criminal code, in theory, a trial could be brought, but it can't under the ICC. And that's why I and various others have been asking about the possibility of forming a new international criminal tribunal, which is a criminal tribunal as opposed to the criminal court. It's a sort of temporary structure, if you like, that could collect evidence and perhaps one day, God knows, if at all possible, bring those charges against the Russian regime. So that's where I was going with that. But that doesn't belittle, by the way, the work of the ICC in any way. It recognizes its important role, but it just says this isn't, you know, it's not one of your capabilities. We're adding to it. And by the way, a huge thanks to Conservatives Abroad for all you do in flying the flag. I am a big, big fan, as some of you on this call know, as I've stopped by in various jurisdictions. Tammy, look, the reality is that today we've got one thing on our minds, which is the challenge we're facing from Putin. But I have to say, one of the things that really strikes me is that the leadership of Vladimir Zelensky is inspirational. This is a guy who in 2019 was elected to lead a country that the time was broken and very divided. And I know nobody will remember any time when the UK has ever been very divided, certainly not in 2019. But he used that period from 2019 to 2021 to unite the country. And he did it phenomenally. I mean, he did it with extraordinary ability and style. And he brought the country together. And it's a reminder of why that matters. Because when the rain comes, when the storms come, you need to try and, good leaders bring countries together. Good leaders know how the integrity of leadership, the shared risk of leadership, the courage of leadership is about, it's about the whole, it's not about the individual. It's about the we're all in this together, which is exactly what Zelensky is demonstrating. And so look, I'd say let's focus on the threat that we face today. Let's bring our country together. And you know, if things change, if facts change, then we'll have to look again. But I think that the fundamental challenge we face is about bringing our country together and making sure that we have the right person to do it. Now, I think, by the way, you know, I mean, this is an entirely vacuous statement that I'm about to make. So this isn't a prediction. But before every election, I think all of us have to look around us and wonder whether or not the person we're selecting as our candidate is the right person to lead, to carry the message, to carry the banner. You know, Dennis, I know, will be asking not only whether I wish to be reselected, but asking other people in the Tunbridge and Morling Conservative Association whether they want to reselect me for the next election. And I think that's the right thing to do, right? I mean, I think it's absolutely right that Tunbridge and Morling should ask themselves whether I'm the best person to carry the banner for the Conservative cause in our community, or whether there's somebody better. And I think we should all do that before every election. So I don't say that, I'm not particularly referring to anybody. I'm just saying, you know, I think it is always right that we always review who are carrying, who are carrying our colours, as it were, into battle, and whether we've got the right person. Because it is far too important. It's not about a single individual. It's not about me. It's not about, you know, anybody. It's far too important when we're going into elections to make sure we get the right person, because we need to win these elections. You know, if Zelensky has shown one thing, it's that getting the right leaders really, really matters. Can you imagine going through this with Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister? I mean, seriously, I mean, forget COVID, but he would be currently asking whether or not we could, really trust NATO and whether we shouldn't be on Russia's side. And could we be absolutely certain that Kharkiv was destroyed by the Russians? Maybe the Ukrainians did it to themselves. I mean, you can imagine the conversation that he'd be having. So I think I think we need to remind ourselves that, winning elections is not a nice to have. It's not an extra. It is absolutely fundamental to our Conservative interest. And we need to make sure that when we're choosing leaders, choosing candidates, choosing, whether you're council or county, borough, district or parliament, it is on all of us to select the right candidates at every level and make sure we've got the right leaders.
Hear, hear. For our final question, we'll go to Giles Carden, please. Tom, if there's anything you'd like to say in closing after that, please do. And then Don, over to you. But Charles, your question, please.
Thanks, Alex, very much. Hi, Tom. Just wanted to thank you because you're MP for my parents' constituency and they're a supporter. So thank you for all you do. But quickly onto my question. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the future of our involvement in NATO, because when Trump was in power, I worried deeply about his commitment to NATO, notwithstanding I don't disagree with some of the remarks about Biden's leadership over the last year or so. But the future of our alliances is paramount, and this links to the questions around investment in our defence capability as well. Thanks, Tom.
Sure, Giles. Look, it's nice to see you, and I'm glad your parents are happy customers. If I can help at all, you know where to get in touch with me. Look, this comes back to the point I was making about international institutions. We've got to invest in them, right? I mean, much as I was deeply concerned about President Trump's approach to NATO and threats to leave it, which I thought were particularly unhelpful, he did have a point, which is that for many years we didn't invest enough in it. Even we, the United Kingdom, didn't invest enough in it, frankly, and a lot of people invested a hell of a lot less than us. And so the change that we've seen in the last month, Putin has achieved what Trump tried to do over 4 years. Putin delivered it in a week, which is doubling the German defense budget, getting Latvia's defense budget up to whatever it is now, 2.5% to 3%. Estonia to have 60 F-35s. Just by the way, we have 48. I'll leave that one with you. Just Estonia, a country of about 3 million people, has 60. We have 48. There's a whole series of decisions which need to go through. But your point about investing in NATO, I think, is absolutely key, because these organizations can end up being hollowed out very, very easily if we're not careful. And then people who seek to exploit things for nationalist gain or for narrow political interest can sell against them hard. And that doesn't just weaken us, it can leave us, frankly, naked when the tide goes out, if you like. And I think we need to be quite serious in the fact that, defense, I'm afraid, is not a nice to have. It's absolutely fundamental. And we need to make sure that we're constantly investing in it. And that's where I'm afraid, now in particular, we need to be honest with our friends and neighbours. It is, I would love to tell you that I'm going to save £45 billion on defence and spend it on your hospital or your school or whatever it happens to be. But that would be grossly irresponsible. What I need to be telling you is, look, I'm really sorry. But if you want to grow up in a free country and you want to, control your future, we need to share this cost. We just do.
Very good. Tom, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining. I know you will all agree, because of the messages you've been passing in, an absolutely first-class session. Thanks to Dan for the marketing, and Alex, as always, to your superb orchestration of the meeting. And so, Tom, to you, we know how very busy you are, incredible. But tonight is very important for the volunteers, the activists, the members from around the globe. And it means a great deal that you've taken time out in the current circumstances to be with us and to go and vote and come back. And that really meant a great deal. Thank you for sharing with us your superiority of insights into foreign affairs. And I know everybody will join with me in wishing you continuing success, not only in the important role as chairman of this important committee, but on other issues. And we hope as the days, weeks, and months go by, your great abilities can be put to even greater effect.
May I just say one last thing? You very kindly mentioned that I'm busy, and I am busy. Let me tell you why not only I do this, but I think it fundamentally matters. If you haven't listened to President Zelensky's 2019 inauguration speech, may I urge you to listen to it? And Don, I'll email it to you, and you can email it round if you like.
Fantastic.
He points out that democracy isn't about me and the other people sitting in Westminster. It's not about him sitting in the presidential office. It's about all of us. We are all members of this parliament. We are all active voices in our political future. And the reason I think it's important that we speak to each other is because I don't own the Conservative Party any more than any of us do, right? This is all of our party. We're all in this together, quite literally. And we need to be thinking really hard about what we want to see and how we wish to see it. And the only way we can do that is by having, frankly, open conversations. And I'll say things that, you know, maybe you won't like, and sometimes you'll say things that maybe I won't like. But we need to have that frank conversation where we're addressing the challenges that we all see in order to achieve the result which we want, which was a future built on conservative principles, not because we're ideologues, but because they're the principles that work, and make sure that that is the conversation we have. And I think we can do it, frankly. I am hugely positive, funnily enough, for a fifth Conservative victory. I have no doubts that we can achieve it. What I'm also convinced of, however, is we as a party need to be remembering that the Conservative principles don't just apply to the country, they apply to the party. And that the power of the individual within the party and the power of the association within the party are just as important as the evolution in the country.
Absolutely right. Absolutely, perfectly put, Tom, and yeah, superbly put. In fact, I don't think I've heard it put better in a very long while. And so please join with me. I think you're all on mute, but please join with me in thanking a great session from Tom. Many thanks, Tom.
Thank you very much. Really good to see you all.
Thank you. Good night, everybody. Good morning to us.
Thank you. Thank you so